47 years I worked at the Del Mar Auto Parts Factory in Buffalo. For almost half a century, my life began at 6 in the morning and ended with the honking of the horn at 3:30 in the afternoon. Esther and I used to joke that the sound of the factory horn had become part of my body. It was the sound that woke me up, ate, and went to bed. Now the buzzer still sounds, but Esther is gone. It's been 5 years since she's been gone. Lung cancer, and in just 11 months she went from a sturdy woman who could lift a sack of potatoes with one hand to a shadow. I didn't like to remember the last days. I preferred to remember how she'd laughed at my clumsy attempts to dance at our Ethan's wedding, how she'd scolded me when I forgot to wipe my feet when I entered the house, how her hair smelled after a shower. Our house on Elmwood Avenue had become too big for one person. 2 stories, with 3 bedrooms and a backyard. We'd once dreamed of filling it with children's voices, but fate had decreed otherwise. Ethan was the only one left. Now I wandered the rooms like a ghost, eating dinner in front of the TV every night and talking out loud, as if Esther could still hear me. At 65, I looked older than my age. Blistered hands with minor injuries from working with metal, thinning gray hair that I stubbornly tucked to the side in an attempt to hide my baldness. In the mirror, I was looking at a wrinkled stranger with perpetually tired eyes. When I retired last year, it seemed to me that now the real life would begin. Fishing, trips to the mountains, maybe even the trip to Alaska that Esther and I had always dreamed of. Instead, I spent my days sitting on the back porch and watching the seasons change, occasionally venturing out to the store or to meet with similarly lonely old people in our neighborhood. My savings were modest but adequate. $450,000 in the account, the result of decades of savings, a lucky investment in the stock of the company I worked for, and Esther's insurance. By local standards, a fortune. I rarely touched that money, continuing to live on my pension and modest dividends. That money was my safety cushion, my assurance that I would never be a burden to Ethan, my son. Ethan was always a good kid, calm, thoughtful, mathematically minded. He was considered quiet at school, but I knew that quietness hid a sharp mind. He didn't follow in my footsteps, which made me glad. Why did he need clothes that smelled of machine oil and a sore back by the time he was 40? Instead, he studied accounting and got a job with a tax company. Stable job, white collar, clean hands, everything I could have dreamed of for my son. When Esther was alive, Ethan came over every Sunday. We grilled steaks in the backyard, discussed baseball games and politics. Sometimes he would stay overnight, and then he and I would stay up late with a bottle of whiskey, talking about everything in the world. After the funeral, these visits became less frequent. At first once every 2 weeks, then once a month, and then the calls were replaced by face-to-face meetings. I understood. He had his own life, work, friends. I didn't want to become that annoying old man who always complained about loneliness. And then Veronique Palmer came into his life. He met her at some corporate event, and 6 months later she moved in with him. Ethan literally glowed when he talked about her on the phone. I couldn't wait to meet the woman who had changed my normally reserved son so much. Our first meeting was at the Blue Moose restaurant in downtown Buffalo. I arrived 15 minutes early, nervously adjusting my tie, a rare item in my closet. I wanted to make a good impression. They were 20 minutes late. Veronique walked in front, a tall woman with raven wing-colored hair and a tight bun and sharp features. She was beautiful, the kind of cold beauty one often sees on the covers of fashion magazines. Expensive watch, impeccable manicure, shoes that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Clifford," Ethan hugged me, and I smelled an unfamiliar perfume. "Meet Veronique." She extended her hand for a handshake. Her palm was cool and dry. "We finally met, Mr. Hewitt. Ethan has told me so much about you." Her voice was melodic with a subtle accent I couldn't identify. "Southern states? Georgia or Alabama, maybe?" "Just Clifford, please. I smiled awkwardly. Mr. Hewitt is my father. She nodded with a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes, and we sat down at the table. All evening I watched them. Veronique worked for a pharmaceutical company, doing some kind of research. When she talked about it, I nodded, though I didn't understand much. She spoke confidently, often interrupting Ethan as if to remind me who was in charge. And Ethan, he looked at her with such adoration that it made me uncomfortable. And then I told that idiot Brandon that if he tried to misappropriate my results again, I'd file a complaint against him. Veronique cut off a small piece of steak and put it in her mouth. You're absolutely right, dear, Ethan agreed. You can't let anyone treat you like that. I remembered Ethan differently. He was always looking for compromise, trying to understand both sides of a conflict. Now he just agreed with everything Veronique said. What did you do at the factory, Clifford? Suddenly she asked, as if remembering my presence. I was foreman in the stamping shop, I answered. I was in charge of making parts for gearboxes. Oh, she wrinkled her nose slightly. That must have been entertaining. I could hear the condescension in her voice. I clenched my teeth but didn't say anything, for Ethan's sake. After dinner, when Veronique retreated to the ladies' room, I asked my son, She seems determined. Ethan brightened. She's amazing, isn't she? Smart, independent. You know, Dad, she makes me a better person. Before I met her, I was so, mediocre. I frowned. You were never mediocre, son. He brushed it off. You just don't see it from my side. Veronique has helped me realize that I can accomplish so much more. She says that in a couple years, I can start my own firm. Something about what he said made me wary. It was like a learned phrase, like he was repeating someone else's words. 3 months later, they were married. The wedding was small, but fancy not something Ethan would have chosen, who preferred modesty in everything. Veronique's parents were gone. They died in a car accident when she was 20, as she told me during a brief conversation at the wedding. After the wedding, our meetings became even more infrequent. Ethan always found reasons. A project at work, or Veronique wasn't feeling well, or they were planning a trip. And when we did see each other, Veronique usually dominated the conversation, sometimes throwing me glances that I couldn't decipher. One day, I tried to invite them over to my house for dinner. You know, Dad, Ethan faltered on the other end of the phone, Veronique's worried about your house. You know, allergies and all that. Wouldn't it be better at a restaurant? My house has always been clean. Esther got me used to order, and I kept it up even after she died. But I agreed, again for Ethan's sake. One day I stopped by unannounced. I just happened to be in their neighborhood and decided to stop by with a homemade pie my neighbor Doris had baked. Veronique opened the door with a look on her face as if I'd brought a dead rat, not a pie. Clifford, she said with a strained smile. What a surprise. Ethan's not home. Oh, it's nothing. I handed her the box of pie. I just wanted to leave this for you. Blueberry, homemade. She took the box with 2 fingers. That's nice. But you know, Ethan and I are watching our figures. We hardly ever eat sweets. I remembered how Ethan had loved sweets as a child, how he could eat a whole pie in one sitting. Another little change I'd noticed in my son. Maybe coffee then, I suggested. I won't be long. She looked at her watch. Actually, I was just leaving, meeting a friend. Maybe another time. And you better call before you visit, okay? I nodded, feeling unwelcome in my own son's house. Gradually, I began to notice that Ethan had changed more than just his habits. He became more irritable, sometimes snapping at my harmless questions. His natural gentleness gave way to a kind of nervousness. One day I asked him about Christmas plans and he literally exploded. Jesus, Dad, that's the 3rd time you've asked me that. I told you we haven't decided yet. I was stunned by his reaction. Ethan had never raised his voice at me before, even as a teenager. I'm sorry, son. I just wanted to know so I could plan. Look, he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a gesture I hadn't noticed before. Veronique wants us to go to her aunt's house in Portland. It's important to her, you know. She barely has any family left. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Christmas had always been our family holiday. Even after Esther died, we spent it together. Of course, I understand. Maybe we can get together before you leave. I don't know, Dad. Things are so difficult at work right now. And Veronique says, more and more of Ethan's sentences started with, Veronique says. Veronique says he needs to change the way he dresses. Veronique says they need to move to a more upscale neighborhood. Veronique says it's time to think about moving up the career ladder. Veronique, Veronique, Veronique. I began to feel a growing gap between us. My son seemed to be drifting away, becoming an extension of his wife, losing his own identity. But what could I do? He was 34 years old, a grown man who had made his own choices. That evening, on my way home, I felt the loneliness come over me with renewed vigor. The house greeted me with silence. I turned on the TV just to hear human voices. What do you think, Esther? I spoke into the void, imagining my wife sitting next to me on the couch. Maybe I'm picking on her too much. Maybe she really does make him happy? Deep down, I knew the answer. Esther has always been a good judge of character. She would see what I saw, the cold calculation behind Veronique's polite smile, her bossiness, her ability to manipulate Ethan. The next day I tried to call my son, but he didn't answer. Instead, a text message came back. Sorry, Dad, really busy. Talk to you this weekend. The weekend came and went and there was no call. I began to adjust to a new reality, a reality in which my only son was becoming more and more distant. My days were filled with the routine of a lonely old man, morning newspaper with coffee, a walk to the park, lunch alone, evening in front of the TV. Sometimes I played cards with my neighbors or went to meetings of our factory's labor veterans club. This monotony was broken by Ethan's call in mid-October. Dad, we have news. His voice sounded excited. Veronique is pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather. I felt my heart jump in my chest. A grandson or granddaughter, a little piece of Esther in me will live on in this child. That's wonderful, son. Congratulations. How's Veronique feeling? She's fine, but she's got toxicosis. The doctor says it's going well. She's due in May. I imagine teaching my grandson or granddaughter how to fish, telling stories about their grandmother, making birdhouses together. We should celebrate, I exclaimed. Come over for dinner this weekend. I'll cook something special. There was a pause. Actually, Dad, Veronica needs to rest now. The doctor said she needs more rest. Maybe a little later? Disappointment pricked me, but I tried not to show it. Of course I understand. Give her my best wishes. And if you need any help... Thanks, Dad. I gotta run, Veronique's calling. And he hung up. I stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, feeling a strange mixture of joy and anxiety. Something told me that this pregnancy would only widen the gap between me and my son, that Veronique would find a way to use the baby to tie Ethan to herself even more and keep him away from me. I pushed those thoughts away. No, I shouldn't think like that. For Ethan's sake, for the sake of a future grandson or granddaughter, I have to try to work things out with Veronique. There must be a way to reach out to her, to find common ground. But the more time passed, the more I realized that my fears were not unfounded. My grandson was born on May 23rd, 2 weeks premature, but perfectly healthy. Ethan called me from the hospital at 4 in the morning, his voice shaking from excitement and lack of sleep. Dad, you have a grandson. 3 kilograms, 900 grams, 51 centimeters. We named him Noah. Noah. I rolled the name around on my tongue, trying to get used to it. It wasn't the most common name, but it was beautiful. Probably Veronique's choice. Congratulations, son. How's Veronique? Tired, but she's doing great. It was a long labor, 13 hours. I heard a woman's voice in the background, and Ethan quickly said, I have to go, Dad. I'll call you later. I wasn't invited to the hospital. I found out about the discharge after the fact, when Ethan sent me a picture of Veronique standing at the entrance to their house with a baby in her arms, and Ethan standing next to her with a bunch of balloons. All three of them looked like a picture from a magazine, the perfect young family. It wasn't until a week after Noah was born that I was allowed to visit. I spent a long time choosing a gift, finally settling on a silver rattle and a teddy bear the size of the baby himself. Veronique opened the door with the baby in her arms, looking flawless, not a trace of recent labor except for a slight shadow under her eyes. "Clifford," she nodded. "Come in. Just keep it down, please." Noah just fell asleep. I tiptoed into the house. Inside, everything had changed since my last visit. There were designer furnishings, obviously expensive. There was new furniture in the living room, looking more like modern art pieces than functional pieces. Abstract paintings in heavy frames hung on the walls. I knew Ethan's salary. He could hardly afford this without a loan. "Here," I held out my gifts, for the baby. Veronique looked at the teddy bear and curled her lips. "Very traditional, but we already have a few stuffed toys. And the rattle. You know, modern pediatricians don't recommend metal toys for babies." I felt myself blushing. Of course, I didn't know the current recommendations. In my day, children were given rattles and nothing bad happened. "Then maybe you can decide for yourself what the baby needs. I can—" "Don't worry," she said. "Noah has everything he needs." At that moment, Ethan came in, visibly gaunt with circles under his eyes. "Dad!" He hugged me. "I'm glad you came. Do you want to see your grandson?" Little Noah slept in a crib that seemed to cost as much as a month's pension. His tiny face was serene, chubby fists pressed against his cheeks. He had dark hair just like Ethan had when he was a baby. "May I?" I reached out to touch him. "I'd rather not," Veronique said quickly. He had just fallen asleep and I wouldn't want him to be disturbed. Ethan threw his wife a guilty look, but he remained silent. I lowered my hand, swallowing my disappointment. Over tea in the kitchen, Veronique talked about the birth, about the first days of motherhood, about her plans to return to work in 6 months. Ethan nodded silently, occasionally inserting a word. I noticed how he kept looking at his wife, as if waiting for her approval after each phrase. "We're thinking about getting a nanny," Veronique said. "Full-time, live-in. I can't afford to be away from work for too long." "A nanny?" I was surprised. "But the baby would only be 6 months old." Veronique looked at me like I was retarded. "Exactly. At that age, you can leave your child with a qualified nanny without any problems. A lot of my co-workers do that." "What about parental leave?" I asked Ethan. "Can't you take a few months?" Ethan opened his mouth, but Veronique answered for him. "Ethan's going through too important a period at work. He's been promoted to senior financial analyst and he can't afford to be away." I looked at my son, but he just nodded, confirming my wife's words. "Besides," Veronique continued, "a good nanny costs money, and we've already spent a considerable amount of money on the nursery and all those endless baby supplies." I caught the hint, but decided to ignore it. "If you need help, I could watch Noah sometimes," I offered. "I have a lot of free time." Veronique smiled, the same smile that didn't affect her eyes. "That's very kind of you, Clifford, but the child needs professional care. Besides, at your age, it would be too tiring. At my age." She made it sound as if I were 90, not 65. "I'm in great shape," I countered, "and I have experience with babies. I raised Ethan, remember, son?" Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Sure, Dad, but Veronique's right, it's a big responsibility. Maybe you could just visit us more often. When Noah's older, when the baby's a year old, 2 years old, 5 years old. There's always some when that postpones my involvement in my grandson's life." I left with a heavy heart. My gifts were left standing in the hallway. Veronique hadn't even taken them to the nursery. I was sure they would end up in the trash can as soon as the door closed behind me. Weeks passed, and I saw my grandson only in the pictures Ethan occasionally sent. Sometimes he called, but the conversations were short and perfunctory. I learned about Noah's milestones from Veronique's social media feeds, where she posted perfectly edited photos with the hashtags #happymom and #idealfamily. When Noah turned 3 months old, I decided to be more assertive. I called Ethan and offered to host a family meal in honor of Labor Day. "I'll make your favorite ribs," I said, "and you can finally show me how grown-up Noah is." To my surprise, Ethan agreed. Perhaps Veronique wasn't around when he took the call. On Labor Day, I had been preparing for the family's arrival since morning. I marinated ribs from Esther's recipe, made potato salad, and baked apple pie. The house was sparkling clean. I'd even hired a professional cleaner so Veronique couldn't complain. They were an hour late. When I opened the door, Veronique stood with a disgruntled expression on her face, holding the carrier with Noah. Ethan looked embarrassed. "Sorry I'm late, Dad. We got held up." "It's okay," I smiled. "The main thing is that you're here. Come on in." Lunch started out tensely. Veronique barely touched her food, constantly checking her phone. Ethan tried to keep the conversation going, but it was obvious he was nervous. Noah slept most of the time in the carrier, and only when I offered to hold him, the baby woke up and started crying. "See?" Veronique threw me an accusing look as she picked up the baby. "He's tired and overexcited. We should probably get going." "But you just got here," I objected. "Maybe he's just hungry." "I know better what my baby needs," she said. Ethan looked miserable, sandwiched between us. "Well, why don't we stay a little longer?" he suggested to his wife. Dad made apple pie. To my surprise, Veronique softened. "That's fine, but I need to feed Noah. Is there a private room around here?" I showed her the bedroom on the second floor, Ethan's former room, which I'd kept almost unchanged from his teenage years. When Veronique went upstairs with the baby, Ethan and I stayed in the kitchen. "How's work going, son?" I asked, cutting into the pie. Ethan sighed. "A lot of work. The new position requires more time, and with a baby, you know." "And how is Veronique doing? Has she started working yet?" "No. She decided to take a full year of maternity leave. Her company's keeping her position." I was surprised. Hadn't she been talking about going back to work soon and needing a nanny? "That's good," I said. "So Noah is spending a lot of time with his mom." "Yeah, but—" Ethan hesitated. "It creates some financial strain. Her paycheck was a big part of our budget. That's what it is. Now I get it. If you need help—" I started. No, Ethan interrupted quickly. "We'll be fine. We just need to tighten our belts a little." Judging by their new furniture and designer things, there was no belt tightening in question. On the contrary, expenses were on the rise. At that moment, I heard Veronique's voice from upstairs. She was talking on the phone, apparently not realizing that she could be heard through the ventilation shaft that ran from the second floor right into the kitchen. The old house had its own peculiarities. As children, Ethan had often overheard Esther and me talking that way. "Yes, we are at his father's house now," Veronique said. "You wouldn't believe how shabby everything is here. A house that should have been torn down last century." I froze before I could get my fork to my mouth. Ethan didn't seem to hear anything. He was too far away from the vent. "No, I haven't talked about it directly yet, but the ground has been prepared," Veronique continued. "Ethan already got the idea that we need money for Noah's future, and the old man is clearly not poor. Have you seen his pension account? $450,000. And what's he saving it for? To take it to his grave?" I felt the blood rush from my face. How did she know about my savings? "And what do you mean? Ethan's already on board with the idea." "Of course, I've thought of everything, Lindsay." Veronica's voice lowered. "First, I'll push a little pity. A poor kid who needs a better education, a better start in life. Then, if that doesn't work, I'll remind her that the old man doesn't have long to live. What could be more natural than leaving money to your only grandchild? Her laughter sounded like shards of glass falling on a tile floor. No, Ethan isn't the problem. He'll do anything I say. You've seen the way he looks at me like a lost puppy. Sometimes it's annoying. I could hardly contain my indignation. My daughter-in-law wasn't just manipulating my son. She was openly planning to get her hands on my life savings. Dad? Ethan's voice brought me back to reality. Are you okay? You look pale. I'm fine, I said. I'm just a little tired. Veronique came down a few minutes later holding Noah in her arms. The baby looked peaceful after the feeding, his tiny hand clutching his mother's finger. He's so beautiful, I said, trying to speak normally even though everything was boiling inside. Can I hold him now, when he's not crying? To my surprise, Veronique handed me the baby. Just be careful with his head, she warned, as if I'd never held a baby before. My grandson's tiny body was warm and surprisingly heavy in my hands. Noah opened his eyes blue, like all newborns, and stared at me with an expression of serious scrutiny that only babies have. Hi, baby, I whispered. I'm your grandfather. Something clenched in my chest. This innocent child is not to blame for his mother's machinations, and I must protect him, both from Veronique and from his father's weakness. You know, Veronique, I said, not taking my eyes off my grandson, I'm thinking of making a will. At my age, it's time to take care of such things. I could see that she was instantly animated, though she tried to hide it. That's very thoughtful of you, Clifford. Yes, I continued. I want to make sure that my savings get into the right hands. Of course, she cast a quick glance at Ethan. Family has to take care of each other. Ethan looked embarrassed but nodded. Dad, you don't have to think about it now. But it's important, honey, Veronique interrupted him. Your father is showing responsibility. The rest of their visit passed in a strange atmosphere. Veronique became noticeably more friendly, even praised my apple pie. Ethan looked puzzled by the sudden change in his wife. I tried to stay calm, though inside everything was boiling with anger and frustration. When they were leaving, Veronique suddenly hugged me. We should see each other more often, Clifford. Noah needs his grandfather. I nodded, keeping a neutral expression on my face. Of course, family is the most important thing. After they left, I sat in my chair for a long time, looking at Esther's picture on the mantelpiece. What would she say now? How would she act in my shoes? The next few weeks brought a surprising change. Veronique started calling me, asking about my health, sending me new pictures of Noah. One day, they even stopped by unannounced to show me how Noah learned to roll over. During one of these visits, Veronique started talking about the future. You know, Clifford, she said, while Ethan was changing Noah's diaper in the other room, Ethan and I are thinking about setting up an education account for Noah, something like saving for college. That makes sense, I nodded. Education is getting more and more expensive. Exactly. She stepped forward. By the time Noah gets in, a year at a good university will cost maybe $100,000. That's a lot of money. Yes, I agreed. Education is expensive. She was silent for a moment, clearly waiting for me to continue. When there was none, she decided to be more direct. We thought you might want to contribute to the future of your only grandson. After all, your savings. It's got to go to the family eventually, right? That's it. That's exactly what she was talking about with her friend Lindsay. I'll definitely think about it, I replied evasively. Veronique didn't give up. You know, with your money, we could give Noah the best start in life. Private school, music lessons, sports. For a 4-month-old baby. I couldn't help but be ironic. You have to plan ahead. She didn't notice or ignored my tone. Good schools have waiting lists years in advance. And of course, we need a house in the right neighborhood. Here's the thing. Not Noah's education, but a new house in an upscale neighborhood. I'll think about it, I repeated. Veronique wanted to say something else, but Ethan came back with Noah in his arms and the conversation was interrupted. After that visit, the calls and messages from Veronique became even more frequent. She invited me to lunches, asked me for advice, which I was sure I would never follow, told me about Noah's incredible progress. Twice she mentioned, as if by the way, that she and Ethan were looking at houses in the Edgerton neighborhood, Buffalo's most expensive suburb. Ethan had changed, too. He became more nervous, called more often, and always started the conversation with questions about my health. One day he asked me directly if I had updated my will. "Are you expecting me to die soon, son?" I joked. Ethan turned pale. "No, of course not, Dad. It's just, it's an important question," and Veronique said, those words again. Things came to a head when Ethan called me late one night, clearly upset. "Dad, can we talk? In person? Tomorrow?" We met at a small coffee shop away from their house. Ethan looked exhausted with deep circles under his eyes. "We're in trouble, Dad," he said, twirling his coffee cup in his hands. "Financial. We're in debt." "What's wrong?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "The new house," he sighed. "We put down a deposit on a house in Edgerton, and now the bank wants proof that we can pay the mortgage. And we can't. Not with my paycheck alone." "You bought a house you weren't sure you could afford." I didn't hide my surprise. Ethan lowered his eyes. "Veronique was sure we could do it," she said. He hesitated. She said, "You'd help, for Noah's sake. This is it. The straight talk I'd been waiting for and dreading." "Ethan," I put my hand on my son's shoulder, "do you really think you need $1 million house to raise a happy child?" "It's not just the house," he avoided my gaze. "It's the neighborhood, the schools, the surroundings." Veronique had studied the statistics, and kids from such neighborhoods had a much better chance of getting into prestigious universities. I remained silent, looking at my son, a smart, educated man who had allowed himself to be manipulated to the point where he was willing to ask his father to empty his retirement savings for a house they couldn't afford. "What did Veronique think of this conversation?" I finally asked. Ethan blushed. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm in a work meeting. It was unexpected. It meant that somewhere deep inside, Ethan understood the abnormality of the situation. "Son," I sighed, "I want to help you and Noah, but I'm not sure buying a house you can't afford is helping. It's more of an indulgence." "But Veronique says—" "What do you say, Ethan?" I interrupted. "Not Veronique, but you. What do you want?" He looked confused, as if the question had never occurred to him. I want my family to be happy." "And you think $1 million house is going to make you happy?" "Veronique will be happy," he said quietly. "And if she's happy, then Noah and I are happy too." I looked at my son and saw a man who had lost himself in a relationship, a man who had put his wife's happiness before his own well-being and common sense. "Ethan," I tried to speak softly, "I'm worried about you. You've changed. You've never made such rash decisions before." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a glimmer of realization in his eyes, which quickly turned to resentment. "You just don't want to help us." His voice became harder. "Veronique was right. You've always disliked her." "This isn't about Veronique," I countered, though that was partly untrue. "It's that you're making commitments you can't fulfill." "We can handle it," he said stubbornly. "If you help us with the down payment and the first installments, we'll take it from there." I shook my head. "Ethan, that's not solving the problem, it's postponing it." "So you're saying no?" There was disbelief in his voice. "You refuse to help your only son and grandson?" "I'm not refusing to help," I replied. "I'm refusing to participate in a venture that could end in bankruptcy." Ethan stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. "You know what? Forget it. We can handle this on our own." He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. I remained seated, staring at the coffee spilling over the table and feeling my last hope of reaching my son crumble. I knew it wasn't over. Veronique is not the type to back down easily. And indeed, 3 days later, the phone rang. This time, it was her. Clifford. Her voice was cold and businesslike. "We need to talk about Noah's future." I agreed to meet with Veronique, but not in a cafe or at their house. I chose a neutral location, Delaware Park near the lake. The place was public enough that Veronique couldn't make a scene, but at the same time it allowed for uninhibited conversation. She arrived without Noah and without Ethan, exactly as I'd expected. It was a conversation between the two of us, a business meeting, not a family council. I arrived early and watched her get out of her shiny black BMW, another acquisition they clearly couldn't afford. She was wearing an expensive suit and sunglasses, which she took off as she got closer. Her eyes were cold, determined. "Clifford." She nodded instead of greeting and sat down next to me on the bench, keeping her distance. "Veronique," I tried to smile. "It's a nice day for a walk." She ignored my attempt at small talk. "Let's cut the small talk. We both know why we're here." I sighed. She was right. There was no point in beating around the bush. "Ethan told me about your conversation," she continued, "about your refusal to help your family." "I didn't refuse to help," I objected calmly. "I refused to finance the purchase of a house you couldn't afford." Veronique crossed her arms over her chest. "The house in Edgerton is not a whim, Clifford. It's an investment in Noah's future. The best schools, a safe environment, connections to the right families." "Veronique," I interrupted, "let's be honest. Noah doesn't need this house. You need it. Noah's only a few months old now, and he doesn't care where he lives." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me what my son needs. And you don't tell me what to do with my money," I said harshly for the first time. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Veronique was clearly readjusting her tactics. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Look, I understand your caution. You've worked your whole life to save this money. But what are you saving it for? You're not a young man anymore, Clifford." There it is, a direct reference to my age and implied imminent death. "Isn't it better to see your savings benefit your family while you can still enjoy it?" She put her hand on mine, and I could hardly keep from yanking it away. "Imagine Noah growing up in a beautiful home, going to the best school, all thanks to his loving grandfather." I stared out at the lake, trying to stay calm. The manipulation was so obvious it was even insulting. Did she really think I would fall for this cheap tactic? "I'd always planned to leave my savings to Noah," I said finally. "But when he's older, when he can decide what he wants to do with it, it'll be too late by then." There was a hint of irritation in her voice. "The most important years of personality formation are early childhood. That's when he needs our support and the right environment." "The right environment can be created without $1 million house," I remarked. Veronique dropped the pretense of softness. "All right, let's be honest, Clifford. I know how much you have in your account, $450,000. For a man of your age, that money is practically worthless. You live modestly, your needs are minimal. But for us, that amount of money could be life-changing." I felt a chill run down my spine. How does she know the exact amount of my savings? Retirement accounts are confidential. "How did you know about my savings?" I asked her bluntly. She hesitated for a moment, then waved her hand. "Ethan had mentioned it. That's not important. What matters is that this money could secure your grandson's future." False. Ethan couldn't have known the exact amount. I never told him. The only way Veronique could have gotten that information is if Ethan somehow gained access to my financial records. Maybe during one of his visits to my house? Or a sudden thought struck me. Shortly after Noah's birth, Ethan had asked me to sign some papers, ostensibly for a tax return related to a newborn gift. I signed without reading, trusting my son. "Does Ethan know that you came to me with this conversation?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. Of course, she lied without hesitation. We talked about everything. He just embarrassed to ask directly. You know Ethan? Yeah, I knew my son. I knew that even if he agreed to this plan, it was only under duress. I need time to think, I said, getting up from the bench. Veronique grabbed my hand. Time is a luxury we don't have, Clifford. We've already put down a deposit. If we don't finalize the deal within 30 days, we'll lose that money. And not only that, we'll lose the house of our dreams. Your dream, I corrected, not Noah's. Our family, her grip tightened. Ethan, Noah, and me, we're family. And you stand by and refuse to help. I gently released my hand. I'll give you an answer in 3 days. Why not now? She didn't hide her irritation. Because this is a serious decision and I want to think about it, I said firmly. 3 days, Veronique, not before. She looked at me with poorly concealed rage, but then she pulled herself together. All right, 3 days. But remember, this is your grandson's future we're talking about. I nodded and walked away, feeling her eyes on my back. Back home, I called the bank and checked all my accounts. As I suspected, someone had requested my retirement account information a few weeks ago. Most likely Ethan, using my information and signature on those documents. I was deeply disappointed, but not surprised. Veronique's manipulation had gone too far. She had turned my son into an accomplice to financial fraud. That evening, Ethan called. Dad, did you talk to Veronique? Yes, I tried to speak calmly. What did you decide? I said I'd give you an answer in 3 days. Pause. Dad, you realize how important this is to us, don't you? We could lose the house. If you've already put down a deposit without consulting me, that was reckless. I couldn't contain my disappointment. Veronique was sure you'd help. I could hear the desperation in his voice. Dad, this is our last chance. If we don't get this house, we won't get this opportunity again. Ethan, I sighed. Son, you're making a commitment you can't fulfill even with my help. The mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the upkeep of a big house, it's all going to cost a lot more than you can afford. We can handle it. His voice rose. Veronique is confident she can go back to work in a few months. Her salary plus mine will be fine. And if she doesn't? If she doesn't get hired back? What if you get laid off? Jesus, Dad, he was almost screaming. Why do you always expect the worst? Why can't you just believe in us? I closed my eyes. My son, my reasonable, sensible son, had turned into a man who yells at his father over money. I promised to give you an answer in 3 days, I said firmly. You will. But 3 days, Ethan. Good night. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time thinking. The situation was worse than I thought. Ethan wasn't just under his wife's influence. He was actively involved in her plan to get my money. Perhaps not fully realizing the consequences, but he was. The next day, I visited my lawyer. Jeffrey Stone had been a friend of mine since his days at the factory. His father had worked there as a mechanic. Jeffrey was now a successful lawyer specializing in family law and wills. They can't access your money without your consent, Cliff, he said after hearing my story. But the fact that they tried to get your account information without your knowledge is a red flag. What do I do, Jeff? I felt cornered. I don't want my money to go to their crazy spending sprees. But if I say no, I'm afraid I'll never see my grandson again. Jeffrey tapped his pen on the table thoughtfully. There are a couple of options. You could set up a trust fund for Noah that would be controlled by a third party, or you could transfer the money to another bank where they wouldn't have access. What if I just go away for a while? A sudden thought occurred to me. Wait for things to calm down? Where would you go? I thought of my old friend Walter Finch. We served in the Army together, then kept in touch through letters and occasional phone calls. A few years ago, Walter moved to Malta, a small island in the Mediterranean. He was always inviting me to visit. Malta, I replied. I have a friend there. Jeffrey raised his eyebrows. Malta? That's radical. But it could work. If you go away for a while, it'll let them know you're not going to give in to pressure. But what about my money? Will it be safe? I'd recommend moving it to a more secure location. Maybe leave some of it in a time deposit and take some of it with you. We discussed the details, and I felt like I was finally taking control of the situation. For the first time in a long time, I could see a way forward. The next day, I visited the bank and withdrew most of my savings. I converted some into traveler's checks and transferred some to a new account at an international bank that could be accessed from abroad. I decided to use the rest of the money for a special purpose that no one but Jeffrey and me could know about. Then I called Walter. He was delighted with my decision to come. "Finally, you old devil," he laughed. "I thought you'd never get out of Buffalo." "Circumstances have changed, Walt." I tried to sound nonchalant. "I decided it was time to see the world." "That's great. My door is always open. When are you coming?" "How about the end of this week?" I booked a plane ticket in 2 days, packed the essentials into one suitcase, and prepared the house for my absence, stopping newspaper deliveries, asking my neighbor Ted to watch the house and water the plants. The night before I left, I called Ethan. "Hey, son, I promised to give you an answer about the money." "Yeah, Dad," he sounded tense. "Veronique's here. I'll put her on speaker." "Hi, Clifford." Her voice was too sweet. "We were looking forward to your call." I took a deep breath. "I've thought about your request, and I've decided you're right. The money has to work for Noah's future." "That's great!" Veronique couldn't hide the triumph in his voice. "I knew you'd make the right decision." "Dad, that's great." Ethan sounded surprised and a little embarrassed. "Let's meet tomorrow and discuss the details," Veronique continued. "We can come to your place or—" "Actually," I interrupted, "I have an important meeting tomorrow. Let's do it in a couple of days." "But we can't wait. There's a deadline to finalize the house deal." "I understand," I said softly. "Don't worry, I'll organize everything. I just need to take care of some formalities at the bank." After some objections, Veronique agreed to a meeting in 3 days. By then, I'll be far away. Before I went to bed, I looked at Esther's picture for a long time. "I'm sorry, darling," I whispered. "I know you'd want me to stay close to Ethan and Noah, but sometimes you need to step aside to see the full picture." In the morning, I left a sealed envelope on the kitchen table with a letter for Ethan. He'll find it when he comes to check on why I'm not answering my cell phone. The cab arrived at 6 in the morning. I took one last look back at my house, the place where Esther and I have lived our entire lives together, where we raised Ethan. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Everything went smoothly at the airport. Check-in, security check, boarding. I watched Buffalo get smaller and smaller until the city became a tiny dot and then disappeared under the clouds. I made my first landing in New York. Then it was a long flight to London, and finally, a plane to Malta. I turned my phone off right after talking to Ethan and Veronique and didn't turn it on until I arrived in Malta. When I finally pressed the power button, the screen exploded with notifications. 37 missed calls from Ethan, 23 from Veronique, a dozen voice messages. I didn't bother listening to them. Instead, I wrote a short message. "I'm safe. Explanation in letter at home. Love you, son." Walter met me at Lucca Airport, tanned, gray-bearded, but still with the same mischievous gleam in his eyes as 50 years ago. "You look like shit, Cliff." He slapped me on the back. "But we'll fix that. Mediterranean sunshine and wine work wonders." His house was small but cozy white walls, blue shutters, a terrace overlooking the sea. A typical Maltese house in the quiet village of Marsashlock in the southeast of the island. "Make yourself comfortable," Walter showed me to the small guest room. "Dinner in an hour. In the meantime, why don't you tell me what really made you drag your ass to Malta?" I sighed and sat down on the bed. "It's a long story, Walt. "Boo, we've got plenty of time," he shrugged. "Nothing else to do in this godforsaken shithole anyway." So I told him everything. About Veronique and her manipulations. About how Ethan had changed. About little Noah, whom I barely knew but already loved with all my heart. About the demand for the money and my decision to leave. Walter listened without interrupting, only nodding or frowning occasionally. When I finished, he whistled. "Damn, buddy. This sounds like one of those Mexican soap operas my roommate watches." "I know," I smiled tiredly. "Sounds like a cheap drama." "No, it sounds like life," he looked at me seriously. "People have always been greedy and manipulative. This Veronique is just a more candid version of what many people hide." The phone rang again. "Ethan." I showed the screen to Walter. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I shook my head. Not ready for this conversation yet. Let him read my letter first. "And what did you write in that mysterious letter?" I remembered the last lines I'd written with a trembling hand before I'd left. "I do not renounce you or Noah. I refuse to participate in the destruction of our family for material goods. When you are ready to speak as a son and not as a go-between for your wife, you know how to find me." "The truth," I answered Walter. "Just the truth." The phone kept ringing, then went silent. A minute later, a message came through. I opened it, expecting to see angry words, but instead it just said, "Dad, please call. I need to know you're okay." I turned the phone off and put it on the nightstand. Explanations would have to wait until tomorrow. Right now, I needed rest after a long journey and even longer months of tension. Falling asleep in an unfamiliar bed, thousands of kilometers from home, I felt strangely relieved for the first time in a long time. It was as if the heaviness I'd been carrying all this time was finally starting to let go. The phone on the nightstand was silent, but I knew it was only temporary. Sooner or later, I'd have to take Ethan's call, and then a new chapter of our story would begin. Malta welcomed me with sun and sea. The first days I just wandered the narrow streets of Marsashlock, watching the fishing boats painted in bright colors and breathing in the salty air. This little fishing village on the southeast corner of the island was so different from Buffalo that sometimes I felt like I was in another world. Walter was the perfect host. He showed me around, introduced me to the locals, but never questioned me about my situation. We often sat on his terrace in the evenings, sipping the local wine and looking out to sea, talking about everything and nothing in particular. "You know, Cliff," he said one evening as we watched the sunset, "when Margaret died, I thought my life was over. 37 years together, and suddenly, emptiness." I nodded. Walter understood my pain after losing Esther as well as anyone. "But then I realized one thing," he continued, pouring wine into glasses. "Life doesn't end, it just changes, and either you change with it or you get stuck in the past like a fly in amber." "Is that why you moved to Malta?" He grinned. "Partly. Margaret had always wanted to see the Mediterranean. We planned a trip, but we kept putting it off. Work, children, grandchildren, and then it was too late." He took a sip. "When she left, I decided I wasn't going to put anything off any longer. Life is too short for later." His words made me think. How many times had Esther and I talked about trips that never happened, about places we wanted to see together? I'd always thought we had a lifetime ahead of us, and it turned out to be only a moment. I still kept my phone off most of the time, turning it on once a day to check messages. Ethan called every day, leaving voicemails, first angry, then pleading, then just confused. Veronique called too, but her messages I didn't even listen to. On the 5th day of my stay in Malta, I received an email from Jeffrey. He informed me that all the formalities with the trust fund had been settled and the money was secure. No one but Noah and myself, once I reached the age of 21, would be able to access it. I was relieved. It was my insurance a guarantee that Noah would get help when he really needed it, without the possibility of Veronique or even Ethan squandering the funds on his whims. Within a week of arriving, I began to settle in. Marsashlock was a small village where everyone knew each other. The locals looked at me with curiosity at first, a gray-haired American, a friend of Walter's, but soon began nodding affably when they met me. My new daily routine was simple: morning walk along the waterfront, coffee at a little cafe by the harbor, help Walter with his boat, dinner under the stars. One day, as Walter and I were fixing his old fishing boat, we were approached by an elderly Maltese man, Paolo, who owned a local restaurant. "Walter," he spoke in a strange mixture of English and Maltese, "my granddaughter can't fix the computer again. Maybe your American friend can help. He's smart, isn't he?" Walter laughed. "Cliff, do you know anything about computers?" I shrugged. "A little. Had to learn in recent years to keep up with the times. That's how I ended up at Paolo's house, helping his granddaughter Sophia set up her laptop. The job wasn't difficult, the usual cleaning of viruses and installing new programs. Sophia, a girl in her 20s, was grateful and offered to teach me a few phrases in Maltese. "Grazie," I repeated after her, trying to pronounce "thank you very much" correctly. "Almost good," she laughed. "For an American, you're catching on fast." The next day at the cafe, an elderly woman, Paolo's neighbor, approached me. "Mr. Clifford," she said with a strong accent, "I heard you helped Sophia with her computer. Could you take a look at my phone?" He stopped showing pictures of his grandchildren. So, step by step, I began to weave myself into the fabric of the local community. Soon I was already helping several elderly residents of Marsashlock with their technical problems. They were simple tasks: setting up video calls so they could communicate with their children abroad, showing them how to use social media, teaching them how to shop online. "You become a local celebrity," Walter joked, "the tech guru of Marsashlock." I brushed off his jokes, but I was secretly glad to feel useful. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something meaningful, even on a small scale. One day at a cafe, I was talking to Elena, a teacher at the local elementary school. She complained that many elderly people in the village feel disconnected from the modern world because they don't know how to use technology. "They need someone to explain things simply, without all this technical jargon," she sighed. "Someone like you, Mr. Clifford." And so the idea of computer courses for the elderly residents of Marsashlock was born. Helena helped organize the space at the local after-school school, and I put together a simple curriculum. We started with the very basics: how to turn on the computer, use the mouse and keyboard, and send emails. 7 people showed up for the first session, all over 60, with varying degrees of technical proficiency. To my surprise, they turned out to be grateful and interested students. They were especially interested in video calls, the chance to see their children and grandchildren who were scattered all over the world. "My daughter is in Australia," said Maria, a 70-year-old widow. "I haven't seen her in 3 years, only pictures in the mail." When we set up Skype and she saw her daughter's face on the screen for the first time, her eyes filled with tears. In that moment, I realized I was doing something really important. The days were adding up into weeks. I still hadn't returned Ethan's calls, though I occasionally turned my phone on to listen to his messages. Judging by them, he'd found my letter, but his response remained unclear. He just asked me to call him back, to tell him I was okay. He didn't mention Veronique. I began to notice I was thinking about Buffalo less and less. Marsashlock, with its measured pace of life, friendly people, and beautiful sunsets, was becoming my new home. I even began to think about renting my own place instead of living with Walter. Meanwhile, my computer classes were becoming more and more popular. The number of students grew to 15, and we moved on to more advanced topics: internet security, online shopping, using social media. I felt useful, in demand. For the first time in a long time, I woke up with a sense of purpose. One evening, returning from class, I found Walter on the patio with a bottle of specialty wine. "What are we celebrating?" I asked, sitting down next to him. Your 2 months in Malta. He poured the wine into glasses. And your transformation from sullen old man to local celebrity. I grinned. I'm not a celebrity, just helping people. Exactly. He raised his glass. Here's to a new life, Cliff. We drank as we watched the sunset coloring the sea orange and purple. Do you ever think about going back? Walter suddenly asked. I was silent for a moment, pondering the answer. Sometimes. I miss home, the familiar places, and Noah, of course. I sighed. But the thought of being in that toxic atmosphere again. You can't avoid talking to your son forever, Walter said softly. Sooner or later you're going to have to answer. He was right, and I knew it. Worrying about Ethan and Noah hadn't gone away. It had just taken a back seat to my new life. Tomorrow, I said firmly. Tomorrow I would call him. In the morning, pulling myself together, I turned on my phone. Dozens of missed calls and messages. I took a deep breath and dialed Ethan's number. He answered after the first beep as if he'd been waiting with the phone in his hands. Dad? His voice sounded both relieved and scared at the same time. Is that really you? Yes, son, it's me, I tried to speak calmly. Jesus, Dad, where are you? Are you okay? We're freaking out with worry. I'm perfectly fine, Ethan. I'm in Malta visiting an old friend. Malta? He seemed stunned. But, why? Why did you just disappear? Why didn't you answer your phone? I left a letter. Did you find it? Pause. Yes, I did. His voice got quieter. But I don't understand, Dad. Why'd you run away? We could have talked about it. Talk? I couldn't hold back a bitter chuckle. Ethan, you and Veronique didn't discuss, you demanded. You backed me into a corner, forcing me to choose between my savings and my relationship with my grandson. That's not true, he objected. We were just asking for help. Veronique was checking my bank accounts behind my back, I interrupted. You made a financial commitment, counting on my money without even consulting me. That's not asking for help, Ethan. It's manipulation. There was a heavy silence. So you just took the money and ran away, he said at last, and his voice was accusatory. Left us to deal with the consequences. I didn't just take the money, Ethan. This is the moment of truth. I set up a trust fund for Noah. What? He clearly didn't see this coming. Most of my savings are now in a trust fund in Noah's name. The money will be available when he turns 21. Until then, no one, not you, not Veronique, not even me, can access it. But, why? He sounded shocked. Because I want that money to go for Noah's benefit, not for a mortgage on a house you can't afford, not for new cars or designer furniture, for Noah's education, for his future, by his own choice, when he's old enough to decide for himself. I could hear him breathing hard. You had no right to decide for us. And you had no right to decide for me, I replied firmly. It's my money, earned through years of hard work. And I've decided that it will go directly to my grandson, bypassing the middlemen. Veronique will be furious, he muttered. Of course she will, because it ruins her plans. You don't understand, his voice shook. We've already signed the papers on the house. We'll lose the deposit if we don't finalize the deal. That's unfortunate, I tried to speak softer, but maybe it'll teach you not to spend money you don't have. Jesus, Dad. He sounded almost desperate. What am I supposed to do now? I sighed. What all adults do, Ethan. Live within your means. Find a house you can afford on your paycheck. Teach your wife that you can't make financial plans on other people's money. She'll never settle for a smaller house. She'll say, I let her and Noah down. Then maybe you should think about whether you've chosen the right person to be your life partner, I said quietly. He was silent for so long that I thought the connection had broken. Ethan, I'm here. His voice sounded muffled. It's just, I need to think about this. Sure. Take some time. I'm not going anywhere. You're coming back? There was hope in his voice. Not anytime soon, I answered honestly. I need space, Ethan. And strangely enough, Here I found something I'd missed in Buffalo. Purpose. Meaning. What are you doing back in Malta? I told him about my computer courses, how I was helping the locals, my new friends, and the beauty of the island. With every word, I could feel the distance between us growing, not only geographically but emotionally as well. I was talking about a new life in which there was no room for him. "It sounds like you're happy there," he finally said. Yes, I was a little surprised at my own answer. I guess I'm really happy. I'm happy for you, Dad. His voice was a mixture of sincerity and sadness. I really am. We talked some more, about the weather, about Noah, who had already started crawling, about my plans for the future. When it was time to say goodbye, Ethan suddenly asked, "Can I tell Veronique about the trust fund?" "Of course," I grinned. "She's going to find out anyway. Just be prepared for a storm." "I'm used to it." A bitterness flashed in his voice, which he immediately tried to hide. "Call again, okay? Don't be gone for too long." "I promise." I really meant it. "And Ethan, I love you, son, no matter what." "I love you too, Dad." His voice trembled. "Take care of yourself." After the call, I sat on the terrace for a long time looking at the sea. The conversation hadn't been as hard as I'd expected. Maybe the distance and time had helped us both see the situation more clearly. Or maybe Ethan was finally beginning to realize the unhealthy relationship he was involved in. Walter found me there an hour later, still deep in thought. "How'd it go?" he asked, sitting down next to me. "Better than I expected," I smiled weakly. "But there's still a long way to go before we're truly reconciled." "Give it time." Walter patted my shoulder. "It's not easy to admit that you let another man run your life." I nodded. "You know what the weirdest thing is? I don't feel guilty about leaving. I don't feel like I have to go back and make things right. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something for myself and not for others. And there's nothing wrong with that." Walter stood up. "Now let's go. Paolo's inviting us to dinner. He says he caught a huge tuna and wants to thank you for helping his granddaughter." That night, sitting around the big table at Paolo's house, surrounded by new friends, I realized I had found more than just a refuge from my problems. I had found a new community, a new purpose, and perhaps a new home. Of course, I missed Noah. The thought of missing his first steps, his first words, was painful in my heart. But I consoled myself that I had created a financial safety net for him that no one could take away from him. Someday, when he's old enough, I'll tell him the whole story. In the meantime, I'll send him letters and gifts, trying to be a part of his life despite the distance. As for Ethan, perhaps my absence will make him think about his relationship with Veronique. Perhaps he'll find the strength to resist her manipulations. Or maybe he'd simply learn to live with the choices he'd made, finding a way to protect himself and Noah from the most destructive aspects of her personality. Either way, it was his path, his life, his choice, and I had my own way now. The day after talking to Ethan, I signed the lease on a small house near the harbor. White walls, blue shutters, a tiny garden with a lemon tree. My new home, my new life. A week after my conversation with Ethan, the phone rang. I was sitting on the terrace of my new home, drinking my morning coffee and admiring the view of the harbor when the phone vibrated. Ethan's number. I answered, preparing for a quiet conversation, but instead of my son's voice, I heard Veronique's shrill scream. "You!" Her voice shook with rage. "How dare you?" I sighed, setting the cup aside. This was to be expected. "Good morning, Veronique," I replied calmly. "Don't you dare speak to me in that condescending tone," she almost shrieked. "You deceived us. You promised to help, and then you ran away and blocked the money." "I set up a trust fund for Noah," I countered. "The money is still intended for him." 20 years from now," she shouted. "What are we supposed to do now? We lost the deposit on the house. $30,000. Do you realize what you've done?" "Do you realize what you've done?" My voice remained steady. "You made a financial commitment with money that didn't belong to you. It was supposed to belong to Noah, your grandson. And now it belongs to him, directly, without intermediaries. I heard her exhale sharply, clearly trying to pull herself together. Look, Clifford. Her tone changed, almost pleading. Let's be reasonable. We can make a deal. Maybe some of the money can be unlocked. For a down payment on the house. Let the rest stay in the fund. No, Veronique. The decision has been made and it's legal. Neither I nor you nor Ethan can change the terms of the trust fund. You'll regret this. Her voice turned cold again. You'll never see Noah again. This is it. The threat I'd been expecting all along. That would be unfortunate, I replied calmly. But I'd already sent Noah the first gift. Directly, via courier. Inside is a letter for him which you will, of course, read instead. And you'll read any future letters I continue to send. And when Noah is old enough to understand, I'll tell him the whole story. About how his mother tried to use him as a tool to get money. She choked with indignation. You wouldn't dare. I'll just tell the truth, Veronique. Always the truth. There was a rumble, like the phone had been dropped, and then I heard Ethan's voice. Dad, it's me. I'm sorry about that. It's okay, son. I expected a reaction like that. Ethan sighed heavily. It's complicated. Veronique is furious. We really lost the deposit on the house, and now she's blaming me for not being able to convince you to help. I'm sorry you're caught between two fires, I said sincerely. Don't be. His voice sounded tired, but there was a new note of determination in it. I'm starting to understand what you were talking about manipulation. I remained silent, giving him a chance to continue. A lot has changed since you left, he continued. Veronique. She showed her true colors. When it became clear that there would be no money, she turned into a completely different person. Cold, calculating. She even offered to sue you. On what grounds? I couldn't help but wonder. She said you were incompetent, that you were out of your mind, that you'd left everything and gone abroad. He was silent. Of course, I refused to be a part of it. Thank you, son. You're welcome, he said quietly, as if he was afraid of being overheard. You know, I've started to notice things I never saw before. The way she controlled me, the way she isolated me from my friends, the way she used Noah. My heart sank. It hurt to hear that, but at the same time I was relieved that Ethan was finally starting to see things. What are you going to do? I asked him cautiously. I don't know, he answered honestly. I love Noah more than anything in the world. The thought of not seeing him every day. I understand, I said softly. It's the hardest decision you'll ever have to make. Do you? His voice trembled. Will you ever come back? I looked out at the sun-drenched harbor, at the bright boats bobbing on the waves, at my new neighbors waving at me. I don't think I'd go back to live in Buffalo, I said honestly. I found what I was missing here, peace, purpose, community. But I'll definitely come visit when I'm ready, and when I'm sure I can see Noah. I'll try to make it happen, Ethan promised. No matter what Veronique thinks. Those words gave me hope. Maybe my leaving really had been the catalyst for Ethan's change. After our conversation, I plunged back into my new life in Malta. My computer courses expanded. I was now teaching classes 3 times a week, and not only older people, but also young moms who wanted to improve their skills in order to find a remote job came to me. I started learning Maltese, although progress was slow. At 65, learning a new language is not easy. But the locals appreciated my efforts and patiently corrected my pronunciation. Once a month, I sent a parcel for Noah, children's books, educational toys, and sometimes just postcards with views of Malta. I put a letter in each parcel, first for Ethan and Veronique, and later, when Noah was older, for him. I told about my life on the island, about the people I met, about traditions and holidays. Ethan reported that the packages were coming in, and Noah especially loved the plush Maltese knight I had sent for his first birthday. Veronique, he said, defiantly ignored my gifts, but did not forbid Ethan from giving them to her son. About 6 months after I left, Ethan called with some unexpected news. "Dad, I moved out on Veronique. I was so surprised that I didn't answer right away." "What happened?" "The last straw." His voice sounded both tired and determined. "I found her secretly checking my email, my phone, even installed an app to track my location. When I asked her, she made such a scene. Anyway, I realized I couldn't live like that anymore." "And Noah?" I asked anxiously. "We had agreed on joint custody. 3 days a week he was with me, the rest of the time with her. It wasn't easy, Dad. She threatened that I wouldn't see him at all if I left. But I talked to a lawyer, and he said the court will almost certainly uphold joint custody." "I'm proud of you, son," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. "I know it wasn't an easy decision." "The hardest decision of my life," he agreed. "But you were right. That relationship was toxic. I just didn't see it until I was in the middle of the storm." "How's Noah? Does he understand what's going on?" "He's only a year and 3 months old, so it's unlikely, but he can definitely feel the tension." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know, I'm thinking about bringing him to you in Malta, when things have settled down a bit. Veronique would be against it, of course, but I have the right to travel with my son. The prospect of seeing my grandson fills me with joy." "I'd be delighted, Ethan. There's so much to see here, even for a baby. Beaches, aquarium, parks. Then we'll make plans, maybe closer to summer." This news gave me a new lease on life. I plunged into preparing the house for Ethan and Noah's possible arrival with even more enthusiasm. I organized a second bedroom, bought a crib, gathered information about local attractions suitable for babies. However, life, as usual, made its adjustments. A week before Ethan and Noah's planned arrival, Veronique filed a lawsuit demanding that I be prohibited from taking the baby out of the country. She claims that I plan to kidnap Noah and never return, Ethan bitterly told her over the phone. This is absurd, but the court postponed the decision, and for the time being there is a temporary travel ban. "She will always find a way to control the situation," I sighed. "Don't worry, son. We'll wait as long as it takes." I was so looking forward to you and Noah finally getting to know each other for real. I could hear the disappointment in his voice. "And we will," I assured him. "If you don't come to me, I'll come to you. When I'm ready." This situation reminded me that it's impossible to leave the past behind completely. The ties that bind us together, whether they be blood ties or just shared memories, are too strong to simply sever. But at the same time, I realized that my decision to leave was the right one. The distance gave me the perspective I lacked in Buffalo. It allowed me to see Ethan and Veronique's situation more clearly, and it allowed Ethan to realize the unhealthy nature of his relationship. Life in Malta continued to go on as usual. My computer courses turned into a small business. I started charging a nominal fee, which was mostly used for equipment upgrades and rent. The local newspaper even ran a short article about me with the headline, "American Retiree Helps Maltese Embrace the Digital World." I made friends, not only Walter but Paolo and his extended family, Elena from school, and an elderly couple, Marios and Annika, who lived next door. We often gathered over dinner, sharing news, discussing local events. I no longer felt lonely. From time to time, I would call Ethan. He told me about his new life, his rented apartment near work, Noah's first words, his ongoing custody battles with Veronique. I listened, offered advice when he asked, but tried not to get too involved. This was his journey, and he had to make it on his own. On the day Noah turned 2, I sent a special gift, a baby camera and an album of photos of Malta I had taken especially for him. I wanted him to know where his grandpa lived, even if he couldn't visit yet. A week after that, Ethan sent me a video of Noah excitedly pushing the camera button trying to take a picture of his toy car. It was the first video of my grandson I ever received, and I watched it over and over again, noticing how similar Noah looked to Ethan at the same age. The same serious eyes, the same focus while playing. One morning, about a year after I moved to Malta, I was sitting on the beach watching the sunrise. It became my ritual to greet the new day by the sea, feeling the first rays warming my face. I thought about the path I had traveled this year, about the decision that changed everything. Was it the right one? No doubt about it. Not only because I had found a new life full of meaning and joy, but also because it catalyzed change for Ethan, helped him see the truth about his relationship. Of course, the price was high. I couldn't see my grandson except in pictures and videos. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings, the longing for Noah became almost unbearable. I imagined teaching him to fish, telling him stories about his grandmother Esther, showing him how to fix old clocks, a hobby I had picked up in Malta. But I knew I had created for him what really mattered: financial security for the future and an example that it's never too late to change your life, never too late to say no to a toxic relationship, even if it hurts. At the end of the day, it wasn't about the money. Money was just a symbol, a catalyst that revealed the true nature of our relationship. It was about boundaries, about self-respect, about the right of each person, even the elderly, to live their lives by their own rules. Someday, perhaps, I will return to Buffalo. Maybe when Noah is old enough to understand, or when the battle between Ethan and Veronique has subsided enough that my visit won't be a new cause for conflict. Or maybe I'll stay here in Malta, in my little white house with blue shutters, among new friends and a new community that has accepted me. And I'll keep in touch with Ethan and Noah from a distance, through letters, calls, packages. It's not perfect, but life is rarely perfect. The important thing is that I've finally found peace. The peace that comes with knowing you made the right choice, even if it was a painful one. The peace that comes when you stop letting others dictate how you live your life. The sun had risen fully above the horizon, coloring the sea with golden tones. I took a deep breath of the salty air and got up off the sand. It was time to go home. I had class at 10 and a new group of students waiting for me. As I walked past the harbor, I waved to Paolo, who was getting his boat ready to go out to sea. "Hey, Clifford," he shouted. "Fishing on Saturday? They promise a good catch." "Sure," I said. 7 o'clock in the morning, as usual?" He gave me a thumbs up and went back to his tackle. I smiled as I continued on my way. Here it was, my new reality. Simple, filled with small joys and big meaning. No drama, no manipulation, no toxic relationships. Waiting for me at home was a letter from Ethan, a real paper letter, which was rare in this digital age. Inside was a picture of Noah sitting on a swing, with a wide smile and my plush Maltese knight in his hands. "He always sleeps with this knight," Ethan wrote, "and calls him Grandpa. I tell him about you every day. We'll definitely visit someday." I pinned the photo to the refrigerator next to other pictures of Noah that Ethan had sent. A little gallery of moments I'd missed, but that were still a part of my life. Maybe our paths with Ethan and Noah will cross again in the future, or maybe they wouldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. I would no longer let anyone, not even the people closest to me, dictate how I lived my life. And if that meant staying in Malta, away from toxic relationships, then so be it. After all, sometimes severing ties is not an act of selfishness, but an act of self-preservation. And sometimes the best thing we can do for those we love is to show them that even at an advanced age, it's never too late to start over.